The Missouri River stretched like molten copper in the early dawn light, its surface barely disturbed by the gentle current that had carved this crossing for centuries. Captain Ezra Thorne stood at the helm of his modest ferry, weathered hands steady on the steering pole as he guided the flat-bottomed vessel through waters he had navigated for the past 15 years. At 68, his silver beard caught the morning breeze, and his pale blue eyes held the tired weight of a man who had seen far too much of the world's cruelty. The ferry itself appeared as humble as its operator. Weathered oak planks formed the deck, patched canvas stretched across a simple frame for shade, and rope railings showed the careful mending of someone who understood that on the river, every detail mattered. Yet beneath the worn exterior, those who looked closely might notice the military precision in how every line was coiled, every surface kept spotless despite the vessel's age. 3 passengers had boarded at dawn for the crossing to Willowbrook Landing. Miss Clara Whitmore, a young teacher barely 22, clutched a leather satchel containing primers and slate boards for the frontier school, where she would spend the next 2 years bringing education to children who had never seen the inside of a proper classroom. Her brown eyes sparkled with the determination of youth, though she glanced nervously at the water swirling past the ferry's sides. Near the bow sat Mrs. Helena Kowalski, 7 months heavy with child, traveling to rejoin her husband who had secured work at the new lumber mill. She rested one hand on her swollen belly while gripping the rail with the other, her Polish accent soft when she thanked Captain Thorne for helping her aboard despite her condition. The gentle way he had steadied her arm and arranged cushions for her comfort spoke to a man accustomed to protecting those who needed shelter. Beside her, Pastor Jeremiah Mills read quietly from a worn Bible, his white hair thin across his spotted scalp. At 71, he was making what he declared would be his final circuit to the scattered settlements, determined to marry young couples and baptize children before age forced him to surrender his calling to younger hands. His soft humming of hymns mixed with the gentle splash of water against the ferry's hull. Captain Thorne moved among his passengers with quiet courtesy, checking that each felt secure and comfortable. His voice carried the gravelly tone of someone who had once commanded attention across great distances, though now he spoke in barely more than whispers. The way he walked suggested old injuries carefully managed, and his hands bore the white scars that spoke of rope burns and blade work from some distant past. But before you discover what happens when these peaceful morning waters turn deadly, if you're enjoying this story of courage on America's great rivers, take a moment to let me know where in the world you're listening from. I love seeing how tales of frontier bravery reach across oceans and borders. Comment your country below. These stories of standing strong travel everywhere. As the ferry reached the midpoint of its crossing, Captain Thorne's practiced I-caught movement in the morning mist downstream. What emerged from the gray veil made his blood turn to winter ice. A sleek river barge cut through the water with predatory purpose, its dark hull riding low and fast. Even at this distance, he could make out the glint of steel and the purposeful movements of armed men preparing for violence. The crimson tide had found prey. Captain Silas Maddox stood at the bow of his pirate vessel, red bandana tied around his shaved head, multiple pistols thrust through his wide leather belt. His crew of 6 river wolves had been hunting these waters for months, preying on ferry crossings and supply barges with ruthless efficiency. They had heard tales of easy pickings at this particular crossing, an aging ferry captain too weak to resist and passengers too scattered to organize defense. Maddox smiled with the cruel satisfaction of a predator who had cornered helpless victims. The old man's ferry couldn't outrun their modified barge, couldn't outfight their superior numbers, and certainly couldn't protect the innocent souls who had trusted him with their lives. This would be another simple matter of overwhelming force followed by the pleasant work of dividing spoils. The gap between the vessels closed with terrible inevitability. Miss Whitmore noticed first, her gasp of fear causing the pregnant woman to look up from her prayer book and Pastor Mills to shade his eyes against the growing light. What they saw approaching through the mist would transform their peaceful river crossing into something none of them would ever forget. Captain Thorne's grip tightened on the steering pole, his knuckles white beneath skin marked by decades of honest work. For 15 years, he had carried passengers across these waters without incident. living the quiet life he had chosen after hanging up his weapons and walking away from a world that demanded too much blood. Now that world had found him again, and innocent people would pay the price for his presence unless he could find some way to protect them. The pirates were close enough now that their shouts carried across the water, crude laughter mixing with the slap of their bow cutting through the current. In minutes, they would be alongside, and Captain Thorne would face a choice he had hoped never to confront again. The pirate barge slammed against the ferry's starboard side with a grinding crash that sent splinters flying and passengers stumbling. Thick hemp ropes with iron grappling hooks flew through the air, biting deep into the ferry's wooden rails and lashing the two vessels together with the practiced efficiency of men who had done this countless times before. Captain Silas Maddox vaulted over the gap between boats with surprising agility for his bulk, his boots hitting the ferry deck with the solid thump of a man who took what he wanted through violence and intimidation. 6 river pirates followed their captain across the gap, each one armed with multiple weapons and wearing the hard expressions of men who had chosen to live outside civilization's boundaries. Cutlasses gleamed at their sides, pistols bristled from their belts, and their clothes bore the stains of previous raids where mercy had been a luxury they could not afford. Their leader stood a full head taller than Captain Thorne, his red bandana bright as fresh blood against his shaved scalp, and his smile revealed teeth stained brown from years of poor living and worse choices. Red Maddox surveyed the ferry's passengers with the calculating gaze of a wolf evaluating sheep, his eyes lingering on the young teacher's leather satchel and the obvious vulnerability of the pregnant woman who pressed herself protectively against the elderly pastor. A fourth passenger, an aging river trader named Samuel Hutchins who had boarded quietly just before departure, tried to make himself invisible near the stern, but found himself trapped like the others in the pirates' expanding circle of control. "Well now, what have we caught in our net today?" Maddox announced, his voice carrying the mock cheerfulness of a man who enjoyed the fear he inspired. "An old river rat playing captain to a load of helpless cargo. This is going to be easier than taking candy from babies, boys. The ferry belongs to the Crimson Tide now, along with everything and everyone on it." Captain Thorne stepped forward slowly, his weathered hands visible and empty, his voice carrying the steady tone of a man trying to avoid bloodshed through reasonable negotiation. "There's no need for violence here, Captain. These are peaceful travelers crossing to Willowbrook Landing. Take what supplies we have aboard and continue on your way. No one needs to be hurt over a simple river crossing." Maddox threw back his head and laughed, a sound devoid of humor that made Miss Whitmore flinch and caused Pastor Mills to clutch his Bible closer to his chest. "Oh, you misunderstand the situation completely, old fishbait. We're not just taking your supplies. We're taking your boat, your passengers' belongings, and anything else that catches our fancy. Then we're going to send this floating wreck to the bottom where it belongs. Can't have witnesses swimming back to shore with tales of the Crimson Tide's business practices." The pirates spread out across the ferry deck with military precision, each man taking a position that cut off potential escape routes, while keeping their weapons ready for instant use. 2 of them began systematically going through the passengers' belongings, emptying Miss Whitmore's satchel and scattering her carefully prepared lesson plans across the deck, where they mixed with the river spray and began dissolving into a legible pulp. Her small cry of distress at seeing months of preparation destroyed brought cruel laughter from the raiders. "Mrs. Kowalski pressed both hands protectively over her swollen belly when one of the pirates stepped close enough that she could smell the whiskey on his breath and see the dried blood under his fingernails. The man reached out as if to touch her face, but Pastor Mills struggled to his feet despite his age and stepped between them with surprising courage. "Leave the lady be. You have no cause to frighten an expectant mother." The pirate's response was swift and brutal. His backhand caught the elderly pastor across the face and sent him sprawling across the deck, his Bible flying from his hands to land dangerously close to the ferry's edge. Mrs. Kowalski screamed. Miss Whitmore dropped to her knees to help the fallen man, and even the normally invisible river trader, Samuel Hutchins, started forward before catching himself and stepping back into the shadows. That's when Captain Maddox noticed the locked wooden chest secured near the ferry's stern, its brass fittings green with age, but its construction obviously meant to protect something valuable. His eyes lit up with the greedy anticipation of a man who had learned that the best treasures were always hidden away from casual observation. Well, what have we here? Open it up, old man. Let's see what kind of valuables a simple ferry captain keeps locked away from prying eyes. Captain Thorne's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, the first crack in his facade of peaceful cooperation. That chest contains personal items of no value to anyone but myself. There's nothing there that would interest men like yourselves. Take the ferry if you must, but leave what belongs to the dead in peace. Maddox's cruel smile widened at the mention of the dead, sensing an opportunity to inflict emotional pain alongside the physical threats that had already proven so effective. The dead don't need personal belongings, River Rat. But living pirates always have use for whatever might be locked away. Boys, encourage our helpful captain to find his key, and if he doesn't have one, introduce that chest to our friend here. He gestured toward a pirate carrying a heavy iron bar designed for breaking through obstacles. Leave the passengers be, Thorne said quietly, his voice dropping to a register that carried surprising authority despite his apparent helplessness. Take what you want from me, but they're under my protection. They've done nothing to earn your attention except trust the wrong ferry captain to get them safely across the river. Maddox stepped close enough to Thorne that the old captain could see the knife scars across the pirate leader's knuckles and smell the mixture of gunpowder and violence that clung to his clothes like smoke. Protection? From you? You're nothing but an old man playing at being tough, while better men take everything you thought you could keep. He drew back his hand and delivered a vicious backhand that sent Thorne stumbling backward against the ferry's central mast, blood trickling from his split lip. The passengers gasped in horror at seeing their protector so easily brutalized, but it was Samuel Hutchins who reacted most strongly. The aging river trader's eyes went wide as he got his first clear look at Captain Thorne's face in the growing morning light, particularly the way the old man's pale blue eyes seemed to change from resigned sadness to something much colder and more dangerous. Hutchins had spent 40 years moving cargo up and down the Missouri River, and he had heard stories that most folks dismissed as tavern tales and drunken bragging. Meanwhile, the pirates continued their systematic destruction of everything the passengers held dear. They smashed the ferry's signal lanterns for the simple pleasure of watching glass shatter, cut through carefully maintained rigging with the casual cruelty of vandals, and began preparing to scuttle the vessel by loosening the boards near the waterline. Miss Whitmore tried to gather the scattered remains of her teaching materials, only to have a pirate kick the sodden papers over the ferry's side, where the current swept them away forever. When Pastor Mills attempted to retrieve his fallen Bible, another pirate deliberately stepped on the elderly man's outstretched hand, grinding his boot heel down until the pastor cried out in pain. That was the moment Miss Whitmore's courage overcame her fear. She launched herself at the pirate attacking the helpless preacher, her small fist striking uselessly against his chest until he grabbed her wrists and shoved her hard enough to send her sprawling across the deck. The sound of the young teacher hitting the wooden planks seemed to echo louder than it should have in the morning air. Captain Thorne straightened slowly against the mast where Maddox's blow had left him, and for the first time since the pirates had boarded, his eyes held something other than resignation. The change was subtle but unmistakable, like winter ice forming over deep water. Samuel Hutchins found himself studying the ferry captain's weathered features with growing recognition, particularly the network of scars along his hands and the way he held himself despite the apparent defeat. Somewhere in the back of his memory, pieces were falling into place, stories told in riverside taverns about a legendary figure who had once ruled these waters with authority that extended far beyond any single vessel or crew. As the pirates continued their reign of terror, smashing and destroying everything within reach while preparing to send the ferry and its passengers to a watery grave, Captain Ezra Thorne remained perfectly still against the mast. But his pale blue eyes had begun to change, taking on the cold, calculating expression of a man who had been forced to make a decision he had hoped never to face again. The morning sun climbed higher above the Missouri River, casting long shadows across a scene that was about to transform from simple piracy into something that would echo through river legend for generations to come. In the growing light, Samuel Hutchins continued to stare at the ferry captain's face, his memory struggling to place features that seemed hauntingly familiar despite the passage of years. Samuel Hutchins edged closer to Pastor Mills as the elderly preacher struggled to sit upright despite his injured hand, his whispered words barely audible above the pirates' continued destruction. "Preacher, that's not just any ferry captain. Look at his hands, the way he moves even when he's hurt. That's Ezra Thorne." Pastor Mills squinted through his pain at the battered ferry captain, confusion evident in his watery eyes. "I don't understand, Samuel. He's just a river crossing operator, been running this route for years as far as I know." The river trader's weathered face had gone pale as old memories crashed back with crystal clarity. "No, sir, that's the river ghost himself. Ezra Thorne commanded the Missouri River for 20 years before he disappeared. Every pirate, raider, and claim jumper from Kansas City to the Dakotas knew that name and feared it more than federal marshals or cavalry units. In the years before the Great Western expansion truly took hold, the Missouri River had been a lawless waterway where honest travelers ventured forth only in heavily armed convoys or under the protection of military escort. River pirates operated with impunity from hidden bases along the countless tributaries and backwater channels, emerging like phantoms to strike at cargo barges, passenger vessels, and supply trains before melting back into the maze of waterways that honeycombed the frontier. Into that chaos had emerged a figure who would become legend among rivermen and terror to those who preyed upon innocent travelers. Captain Ezra Thorne had started as a simple cargo hauler, but when raiders killed his business partner and stole everything they had worked years to build, he made a decision that would reshape river commerce throughout the entire Missouri Basin. He armed his remaining vessel, recruited men who shared his vision of safe passage for honest travelers, and began hunting the hunters with methodical precision. Within 2 years, the River Ghost commanded a fleet of 12 armed riverboats that patrolled the Missouri and its major tributaries with military efficiency. His crews were composed of former soldiers, displaced rivermen whose livelihoods had been destroyed by piracy, and anyone else with the courage to stand against the lawless gangs that had turned America's great river into their personal hunting ground. They fought with discipline that regular pirates could never match, using superior tactics and intimate knowledge of river conditions to defeat forces that outnumbered them 3-1. The Ghost's reputation grew with each successful engagement against river pirates and claim jumpers. His boats appeared wherever honest travelers needed protection, emerging from morning mists like avenging spirits to scatter raiding parties and escort supply trains safely to their destinations. He charged fair prices for protection services, but anyone who genuinely could not afford payment received his safeguarding anyway, earning him loyalty that extended far beyond simple business relationships. For 15 years, Captain Thorne's fleet maintained order along hundreds of miles of waterway that had previously belonged to whoever possessed the most guns and the least conscience. Trading companies prospered under his protection. New settlements sprang up along riverbanks that had been too dangerous for honest families, and the Missouri River became a highway for legitimate commerce instead of a hunting ground for predators. Then came the massacre that ended everything. River pirates calling themselves the Crimson Brotherhood had been operating with unusual coordination and intelligence, striking at targets that should have been impossible for them to know about in advance. Thorne suspected treachery within his own organization, but could not identify the source until it was too late. His flagship, the Riverwatch, had been carrying his wife Margaret and 80-year-old daughter Sarah to visit family in St. Joseph when the trap was sprung. 30 pirates and 6 boats had surrounded the Riverwatch in a narrow channel where Thorne's superior tactics meant nothing against overwhelming numbers and advanced knowledge of his route. They demanded not just his cargo but his complete surrender and the dissolution of his entire fleet. When Thorne refused, they began systematically murdering his passengers and crew, starting with the most vulnerable to break his resolve. Margaret Thorne died trying to shield their daughter from pirate cutlasses. Little Sarah lasted only moments longer before cruel men decided that witnesses were inconvenient regardless of age. By the time Thorne fought his way through the boarding parties to reach his family, he found only blood on the deck and silence where laughter should have been. The River Ghost's vengeance against the Crimson Brotherhood became the stuff of legend, but it cost him everything that remained of his humanity. He hunted down every member of that organization with relentless precision, showing them exactly the same mercy they had shown his wife and daughter. When the last pirate involved in the massacre breathed his final breath, Ezra Thorne disbanded his fleet, sold his remaining vessels, and disappeared from the river that had been his life. That was 15 years ago, and Samuel Hutchins had assumed, like everyone else, that the river ghost was dead, killed in some nameless battle, or simply worn down by the violence that had consumed his later years. Instead, the legend had been running a simple ferry crossing, carrying peaceful passengers back and forth across the same waters where he had once dispensed frontier justice with cannon and cutlass. Back in the present, Captain Maddox grew tired of waiting for cooperation and gestured impatiently toward the locked chest that had caught his attention. "Break it open, Garrett. Let's see what treasures our helpful ferry captain has been hiding from honest pirates who work hard for their living." Captain Thorne straightened slowly against the mast, blood from his split lip mixing with the silver of his beard. "That won't be necessary." He reached into his vest and withdrew an ornate brass key that caught the morning light like captured fire. "I'll open it myself." The pirates gathered around as Thorne knelt beside the wooden chest, their weapons ready, but their attention focused on whatever valuables might be hidden within. The lock clicked open with the solid sound of quality craftsmanship, and Thorne lifted the heavy lid to reveal contents that made several pirates lean forward with greedy anticipation. Inside lay a naval officer's coat of midnight blue wool with gold braiding that had darkened with age, but still spoke of authority and command. Beneath it, wrapped in oiled leather, rested a spyglass engraved with elegant script that read, "To the River Ghost, with gratitude for safe passage, Missouri River Trading Company." At the bottom of the chest, nestled in custom-fitted compartments, lay twin naval pistols with ivory grips carved in intricate designs that spoke of master craftsmanship and deadly purpose. The pirates burst into laughter at what they perceived as an old man's pathetic attempt at intimidation through costume and theater. "Look at this, boys," Maddox chuckled with genuine amusement. "The ferry rat thinks he's going to scare us with an old uniform and some fancy guns. What are you planning to do, Grandpa? Dress up and play soldier while we sink your boat and take your passengers for entertainment?" Captain Thorne stood slowly, lifting the naval coat from the chest with the reverence of a man handling sacred relics. He slipped his arms through the sleeves with ceremonial precision, the gold braiding catching sunlight as the garment settled across his shoulders with the perfect fit of something made specifically for his frame. The transformation was immediate and startling, as if the simple act of donning the coat had restored 20 years of authority and command presence. His voice, when he spoke again, carried none of the resigned acceptance that had characterized his earlier attempts at negotiation. Instead, it held the cold certainty of a man who had commanded other men in life-and-death situations and expected immediate obedience to his orders. "I gave you a chance to leave these passengers in peace and continue on your way downriver. That opportunity has passed. Now it's too late for any of you." Maddox wiped tears of laughter from his eyes, still convinced he was witnessing the desperate theatrics of a helpless old man facing inevitable defeat. "What's an old costume going to do against steel and shot, River Rat? You think putting on fancy clothes makes you something more than ferry trash?" Samuel Hutchins rose to his feet with the deliberate movements of a man who recognized history unfolding before his eyes. His voice carried clearly across the ferry deck as he made an announcement that would change everything. "That's Captain Ezra Thorne standing before you, the River Ghost himself. He sent 43 pirate crews to the bottom of this river and made the Missouri safe for honest travelers when no one else would stand against the raiders." The old river trader's words hung in the morning air like smoke from cannon fire, and for the first time since boarding the ferry, the pirates seemed uncertain about their overwhelming advantage. Captain Thorne adjusted the naval coat's collar with mechanical precision, his pale blue eyes now holding the winter coldness that had once made grown men surrender rather than face him in open combat. The River Ghost had returned to his river, and the morning's peaceful crossing was about to become something that would echo through frontier legend for generations to come. The transformation in Captain Thorne's bearing was so complete that even the pirates fell momentarily silent, their crude laughter dying as they found themselves facing something far different from the helpless ferry operator they had expected to terrorize. The river ghost reached for the ferry's steering pole, a 12-foot length of seasoned oak that he had used for peaceful navigation just minutes earlier, and in his hands it became something else entirely. The first demonstration of his legendary skills came without warning. Two pirates had moved close enough to grab the passengers huddled near the stern when Thorn's steering pole swept through the air with the fluid precision of a master swordsman. The heavy oak caught the first raider across the wrist with surgical accuracy, sending his cutlass spinning over the ferry's rail to disappear beneath the Missouri's brown waters with barely a splash. The backswing connected with the second pirate's knee with a crack that echoed across the water, dropping the man to the deck where he clutched his shattered leg and howled in agony. Captain Maddox's eyes widened as he watched two of his experienced fighters neutralized in the space of a heartbeat by an opponent who moved with the economic efficiency of someone who had spent decades perfecting the art of river combat. This was not the desperate flailing of a cornered victim, but the calculated violence of a professional who understood exactly how much force was needed to disable without killing unless absolutely necessary. "Get him, you idiots," Maddox roared, drawing his own cutlass and advancing toward the ferry captain who had somehow shifted the balance of power through nothing more than superior skill and intimate knowledge of his vessel. Don't let one old man make fools of the entire Crimson Tide crew. But Thorn was already moving, using his perfect understanding of the ferry's construction and the river's current to turn familiar features into tactical advantages that his opponents could never anticipate. He backed toward the boat's center where the main support beam created a natural choke point, forcing the remaining pirates to approach him one or two at a time instead of overwhelming him through sheer numbers. Every rope, cleat, and deck fixture became part of his defense as he demonstrated why the River Ghost had dominated these waters for 20 years. The ferry's boom swung across the deck as Thorn released a carefully positioned line, the heavy wooden beam catching one pirate in the chest and launching him backward into his companions with enough force to tangle three men in a cursing heap of arms and legs. Meanwhile, Thorn used his knowledge of the vessel's weight distribution to shift the ferry's angle in the current, creating an unstable platform that left the pirates struggling for footing while he moved with the confident ease of someone who had walked these particular planks thousands of times. "You need to get the passengers to safety," Thorn called to Samuel Hutchins, his voice carrying the calm authority of a battlefield commander issuing orders under fire. "Stern cabin now. Bar the door and keep low until this is finished." The aging river trader needed no further encouragement, helping Pastor Mills to his feet despite the elderly preacher's injured hand, while Miss Whitmore supported Mrs. Kowalski's pregnant form toward the small enclosed space at the ferry's rear. The young teacher's eyes never left Captain Thorn as he systematically dismantled the pirate boarding party with a combination of tactical brilliance and 40 years of accumulated river fighting experience. Thorn's mental assessment of his opponents proceeded with the cold calculation that had made him legendary among Missouri River traders. The pirate advancing from his left favored his right leg, probably from an old wound that would slow his recovery from any stumbling blow. The man approaching from starboard carried his cutlass too high, leaving his ribs exposed to a thrust from the steering pole's iron-shod tip. The third raider hung back slightly, suggesting either cowardice or intelligence that might make him more dangerous than his companions. The ferry's shallow draft, designed for crossing sandbars and navigating fluctuating water levels, became another weapon in Thorn's arsenal as he began maneuvering the vessel toward a stretch of river where underwater obstacles would severely limit his opponent's options. His intimate knowledge of every snag, sandbar, and submerged rock along this crossing allowed him to position the ferry where the pirate's heavier barge would be forced to maintain a disadvantageous angle or risk running aground. One of the raiders made the mistake of rushing forward without considering the ferry's motion, his boots slipping on planks made treacherous by river spray. Thorn's steering pole swept low, catching the man's ankles and sending him tumbling over the rail in a splash that brought grim satisfaction to passengers who had watched these same pirates terrorizing innocent travelers just moments earlier. The pirate's head broke the surface downstream, his desperate swimming carrying him toward the far shore, but away from any chance of rejoining the fight. 2 down, for remaining plus their captain, Thorne calculated as he continued using the ferry's features to maintain his defensive advantage. The vessel's low railings allowed him to duck beneath wild, cutlass swings, while the raised center platform gave him elevation for devastating overhead strikes with his improvised weapon. Every aspect of the ferry that had served peaceful travelers now contributed to a tactical display that reminded anyone watching why the River Ghost's reputation had once made pirates seek easier prey in distant waters. Captain Maddox was beginning to understand that he faced something far beyond his crew's experience or training. The casual ease with which Thorne disabled his men spoke of someone who had fought more battles than any of the Crimson Tide raiders could imagine, someone who approached violence with the methodical precision of a craftsman perfecting his trade. Sweat began beading on the pirate captain's forehead despite the cool morning air, and his voice carried a note of uncertainty that his remaining crew had never heard before. Thorne demonstrated his legendary marksmanship by drawing one of the naval pistols from the open chest, the ivory-gripped weapon appearing in his hand with the smooth motion of someone who had performed this action countless times under desperate circumstances. His shot took the rope holding the pirate's boarding planks with surgical precision, sending the heavy wooden bridges tumbling into the river and cutting off the raiders' escape route to their own vessel. The sound of the gunshot echoed across the water like thunder, and smoke drifted from the pistol's barrel as Thorne already moved to engage the next threat. The psychological impact of watching their retreat eliminated proved as devastating as any physical blow Thorne might have delivered. Pirates who had boarded the ferry with absolute confidence in their overwhelming advantage now found themselves trapped on an enemy vessel with a legendary fighter who controlled every aspect of their battlefield. The easy prey they had expected to terrorize had transformed into an apex predator who used their own aggression against them with devastating efficiency. From the stern cabin where the passengers had taken shelter, Miss Whitmore watched through a gap in the wooden boards as the helpless ferry captain revealed himself to be something from frontier legend. Pastor Mills whispered prayers for their deliverance, while Mrs. Kowalski held her unborn child and marveled at the providence that had placed them under the protection of the River Ghost himself. Samuel Hutchins simply nodded with the satisfaction of a man whose memory had proven accurate despite the passage of years. Another pirate fell to Thorne's superior tactics when he attempted to circle behind the ferry captain, only to discover that the vessel's layout offered no true concealment from someone who knew every inch of its construction. The raider found himself caught between the ferry's wheel housing and the central mast, trapped in a position where his cutlass became useless, while Thorne's longer weapon found its mark with punishing accuracy. The man dropped his blade and raised his hands in surrender, the fight beaten out of him by an opponent who controlled the engagement so completely that resistance seemed futile. Captain Maddox realized with growing horror that his crew of experienced river pirates was being systematically destroyed by a single old man who fought with the calm confidence of someone who had faced longer odds and prevailed through superior skill and river knowledge. The easy raid that should have netted them a ferry, passengers, and cargo was becoming a disaster that would echo through every pirate stronghold along the Missouri River. Only 3 of his original crew remained capable of fighting, and even they showed signs of wavering as they witnessed tactics and abilities that exceeded anything in their violent experience. The River Ghost had returned to claim his waters, and the Crimson Tide was about to discover why that name had once been spoken in whispers throughout the frontier underworld. Thorne's pale blue eyes held the cold calculation of a predator who had cornered his prey, and his voice carried the quiet certainty of a man who controlled every aspect of the developing situation. You still have time to surrender and swim for shore. Continue this fight, and some of you won't live to see sunset. Choose quickly, because my patience for reasoning with pirates ended when you put your hands on innocent passengers. The ferry deck had become a battlefield littered with disabled pirates and broken weapons, but Captain Maddox stood defiant among the wreckage of his crew's confidence, his red bandana dark with sweat and his cutlass steady in his scarred hand. 2 of his remaining raiders flanked him with the desperate loyalty of men who understood that surrender meant frontier justice, while their captain's eyes held the wild light of someone who had realized that retreat was no longer possible. You fight well for river trash, Maddox snarled, wiping blood from a cut on his cheek where Thorn's steering pole had found its mark during the earlier skirmish. But you're still just one old man against 3 professionals who've been killing since before you started playing ferry captain. This ends with you feeding the fishes and your passengers learning what happens to folks who travel with the wrong protection. Captain Thorn set down his steering pole and reached into the open chest, withdrawing the second naval pistol and checking its priming with the methodical calm of someone who had performed these actions under fire more times than he could count. His pale blue eyes studied the remaining pirates with the calculating gaze of a predator who had identified exactly how the final confrontation would unfold, and his voice carried the winter cold that had once made hardened criminals surrender rather than face the river ghost in open combat. Before we finish this, there's something you should know about the crew that murdered my family 15 years ago, Thorn said quietly, his words cutting through the morning air with surgical precision. The Crimson Brotherhood thought they were clever, using inside information to set their trap and overwhelm my flagship through treachery instead of skill. They killed my wife Margaret and my daughter Sarah to break my resistance, then laughed while innocent blood stained my deck. Maddox's confident sneer faltered slightly, as something cold crawled up his spine, a memory that he had buried beneath years of subsequent violence and successful raids. The pirate captain's hand tightened on his cutlass grip, while his mind raced backward through time to a raid that had made his reputation and established the Crimson Brotherhood as the most feared organization on the Missouri River. I was there, old man, Maddox said slowly, understanding beginning to dawn in his bloodshot eyes. I remember that raid. Remember the woman who tried to shield her brat with nothing but prayers and tears. We took your precious river ghost fleet apart piece by piece, and you never even saw us coming. Your family died because you thought you were untouchable, thought your reputation would protect them from real pirates who didn't fear ghost stories. Captain Thorn's expression never changed, but something shifted in his posture that made the morning air seem suddenly colder despite the climbing sun. Then this was always going to end here on this river, with you and me settling accounts that have waited 15 years to be balanced. I've been hoping someone from that crew would find their way back to these waters eventually. The psychological impact of this revelation electrified the remaining combat, as both men understood that they were no longer fighting over a simple ferry raid, but settling a blood debt that had shaped the rest of Thorn's life. Maddox charged forward with the desperate fury of someone who recognized his own death in his opponent's eyes, his cutlass cutting viciously toward the ferry captain's throat in an attack designed to end the fight through overwhelming aggression. But Thorn had been expecting exactly this response, and he sidestepped the wild swing while drawing his naval sword from the chest with the fluid motion of someone who had trained with blade work for decades. The clash of steel on steel rang across the water as cutlass met naval sword in a deadly dance that showcased the difference between brutal piracy and military precision. Maddox was skilled with his weapon, had killed men in close combat across half the frontier, but he found himself facing an opponent who fought with the disciplined technique of formal training combined with the ruthless efficiency of someone who understood that mercy was a luxury he could not afford. Thorn's blade work demonstrated the difference between a man who fought for profit and one who fought to protect everything he held sacred. The 2 remaining pirates attempted to flank Thorn during the duel, but the ferry captain had maneuvered the fight toward a specific section of the vessel for reasons that became apparent when he triggered a mechanism hidden beneath what appeared to be a simple cargo cover. The wooden panel slid aside to reveal brass fittings and iron reinforcements that spoke of modifications far beyond anything needed for peaceful river crossing. You see, gentlemen, Thorn said as his sword continued to parry Maddox's increasingly desperate attacks, I never truly retired from protecting these waters. I simply became more selective about when and how I chose to engage threats to innocent travelers. The ferry's port side erupted in controlled violence as a concealed cannon emerged from what had appeared to be solid planking, its brass barrel gleaming in the morning light as hidden pulleys and counterweights positioned the weapon for firing. The modification was a masterpiece of disguised engineering, allowing the humble ferry to transform into a warship in the space of heartbeats, while maintaining the appearance of civilian vessel to any casual observer. Thorn had spent 15 years perfecting these hidden defenses, creating a mobile fortress that could respond to exactly the kind of threat that had destroyed his family and ended his fleet. Every peaceful crossing had been conducted aboard a vessel capable of dealing death with cannon fire, though he had prayed never to need such capabilities again. The cannon's roar echoed across the Missouri River like thunder, its chain shot tearing through the pirates' escape barge with devastating efficiency. Planks exploded in showers of splinters, rigging collapsed in tangled ruin, and the vessel that had carried the Crimson Tide to their intended raid began settling toward the river bottom with the inexorable finality of superior firepower applied with surgical precision. The psychological impact on the remaining pirates was immediate and complete. Their escape route had vanished in smoke and thunder. Their supposedly helpless prey had revealed himself as a legendary fighter with hidden weapons, and their captain faced an opponent who fought with the cold determination of someone settling a blood debt 15 years in the making. One of Maddox's remaining crew threw down his weapons and raised his hands in surrender, unwilling to continue a fight that had shifted so completely against them. The other raider looked desperately toward the sinking barge, calculated the distance to shore, and decided that swimming offered better odds than facing the river ghost's continued attention. But Maddox himself fought on with the desperate fury of a man who understood that surrender would mean facing frontier justice for murders that stretched across years of piracy. His cutlass work became wilder, more aggressive, as he attempted to overwhelm Thorn's superior technique through sheer violence and desperation. The ferry captain's response demonstrated why his reputation had once made pirates seek easier prey in distant waters. His naval sword moved with economical precision, each parry flowing into a riposte that left fresh cuts on Maddox's arms and chest without delivering the killing blow that would have ended the fight immediately. Thorn was not simply defending himself, but methodically wearing down an opponent whose skills could never match formal training combined with decades of practical experience. "You're going to die slowly, old man," Maddox gasped between increasingly labored sword strokes, his earlier confidence replaced by the desperate threats of someone who could feel control slipping away with each exchange. "Even if you kill me, there are more crews on this river, more pirates who'll come hunting for the famous river ghost. You can't protect everyone, can't be everywhere at once." Thorn's response came not through words, but through a combination of blade work and tactical positioning that demonstrated the difference between a professional warrior and a criminal who had survived through luck and brutality. His sword found the gap in Maddox's defense, sliding past the pirate's guard to rest against his throat with just enough pressure to draw a thin line of blood. But instead of delivering the killing thrust that would have ended their confrontation, Thorn stepped back and lowered his weapon, his pale blue eyes holding the cold satisfaction of a man who had achieved exactly what he intended. Maddox stumbled backward, one hand pressed to his bleeding throat, his cutlass trembling in his other fist as he struggled to understand why he remained alive. "Because killing you quickly would be mercy you don't deserve," Thorn said quietly, his voice carrying the finality of judgment rendered after long consideration. "You're going to live long enough to face frontier justice for Margaret and Sarah and every other innocent person your crew murdered over the years. Then you're going to hang legally, properly, in front of witnesses who'll remember that some crimes don't go unpunished forever." Maddox's final desperate move came without warning, a hidden knife appearing in his left hand as he lunged toward the stern cabin where the passengers had taken shelter. If he could seize hostages, threaten innocent lives, perhaps he could still negotiate his way out of this catastrophe that had destroyed his crew and revealed his intended victims as something far more dangerous than expected. But Captain Thorn had been anticipating exactly this possibility, and his intimate knowledge of the ferry's construction allowed him to trigger another hidden mechanism. The deck planks beneath Maddox's feet separated along concealed hinges, dropping the pirate captain into the ferry's shallow hold where he landed hard among spare rope and canvas, with his knife spinning uselessly away into the darkness. The remaining surrendered pirates stared in amazement at modifications that transformed a simple river-crossing vessel into something approaching a warship, while from the stern cabin came the sound of passengers who had witnessed the river ghost's final battle against the criminals who had destroyed everything he once held dear. Captain Thorn stood over the trapped pirate captain, his naval sword still ready but no longer needed, his pale blue eyes holding the satisfaction of a man who had finally settled accounts that had haunted him for 15 years. The morning sun climbed higher above the Missouri River, casting light across a scene that would become legend among frontier travelers who valued courage over comfort and justice over easy profit. The silence that followed Captain Maddox's capture seemed to stretch across the Missouri River like a held breath, broken only by the gentle lapping of water against the ferry's hull and the distant splash of the surviving pirates swimming desperately toward the far shore. Captain Thorne stood over the trapped pirate captain with his naval sword still drawn, but the cold fire that had burned in his pale blue eyes during combat was already cooling to the tired resignation of a man who had been forced to become something he had hoped to leave buried in the past. The first priority was ensuring his passengers had suffered no lasting harm from their ordeal. Thorne helped Pastor Mills from the stern cabin, checking the elderly preacher's injured hand with the gentle competence of someone who had tended battlefield wounds in circumstances far worse than a simple ferry crossing. Miss Whitmore emerged with protective arms around Mrs. Kowalski, both women pale but unharmed, their eyes wide with awe at having witnessed frontier legend come alive before them. Samuel Hutchins appeared last, his weathered face bearing the satisfied expression of a man whose memory had proven accurate despite the passage of years. "I knew those hands the moment I saw them in good light," he said quietly to Captain Thorne as the ferry captain secured the naval pistols and began restoring his vessel to its peaceful configuration. 40 years on this river, and I never forgot the stories about the river ghost. Never thought I'd see the day when legend walked among us again." Within hours, word of the morning's events began spreading along the Missouri River network with the speed that only truly extraordinary news could achieve. River traders, ferry operators, and settlement officials carried the story from landing to landing, each telling adding details and emphasis until the tale grew beyond simple recounting into something approaching myth. The river ghost had returned for one final battle, had protected innocent passengers against overwhelming odds, and had captured one of the most notorious pirate captains to operate these waters in recent memory. 2 weeks after the confrontation, Captain Thorne found himself in the territorial courthouse at Independence, testifying before a federal judge about crimes that stretched back 15 years and included murders, piracy, and attacks on legitimate commerce throughout the Missouri River basin. Captain Silas Maddox sat in shackles at the defendant's table, his red bandana replaced by prison clothes, his confident sneer replaced by the hollow stare of a man who understood that his reign of terror had finally reached its end. The testimony took 3 days to complete, with witnesses traveling from as far as the Dakota Territory to describe attacks that bore the signature of Maddox's criminal organization. Miss Clara Whitmore spoke with quiet courage about watching helpless passengers terrorized by men who took pleasure in inflicting fear, while Pastor Mills described the moment when an aging ferry captain had transformed into something from frontier legend to protect those under his care. Mrs. Helena Kowalski's husband arrived from the lumber mill to escort his pregnant wife home, but not before she could tell the court about traveling under the protection of the river ghost himself and seeing justice delivered with precision that left the innocent unharmed while ensuring that criminals faced consequences for their actions. Her testimony brought tears to hardened frontier lawmen who understood the difference between legal justice and frontier revenge. The judge's sentence reflected both the severity of Maddox's crimes and the frontier's appreciation for those who stood against lawlessness when official authority proved inadequate. Death by hanging, to be carried out in 30 days, with the execution scheduled to take place in the same courthouse square where other pirates had learned that the expanding frontier would not tolerate predators who preyed upon honest travelers. 1 month later, Captain Thorne received an official delegation from the Missouri River Trading Company, 3 well-dressed gentlemen who had traveled from St. Louis with an offer that would have restored him to command of the largest anti-piracy fleet ever assembled in American waters. They spoke of new threats emerging as westward expansion created opportunities for organized crime, of the need for experienced leadership to protect commerce along waterways that stretched from Pittsburgh to the Pacific coast. Their offer was generous beyond imagination, including command of a dozen armed steamboats, authority to recruit and train crews according to his own standards, and compensation that would have made him wealthy beyond anything he had known during his original career as the River Ghost. They painted visions of a river system made safe for families and honest merchants, of frontier communities that could grow and prosper under the protection of professional lawmen who understood both water tactics and criminal psychology. Captain Thorne listened to their proposal with the courteous attention of someone who understood the honor they offered, but his response came without hesitation or uncertainty. "Gentlemen, I appreciate both your confidence and the scope of what you're offering, but I've seen enough war to last several lifetimes. The river deserves peace, and so do the people who depend on it for their livelihoods. I'll continue operating my ferry crossing, protecting passengers who trust me with their safety, but my days of hunting pirates across hundreds of miles of waterway are finished." 3 months after the confrontation that had restored his legend, Thorne's ferry carried passengers who included the families of those he had saved during Maddox's final raid. Miss Clara Whitmore brought her entire school class for an educational crossing, teaching children about the courage required to stand against injustice while showing them the gentle man who had once been their parents' protector during darker times. The young teacher had used the story of the River Ghost's final battle as a lesson about how ordinary people could accomplish extraordinary things when innocent lives depended on their courage. Her students listened with wide-eyed fascination to accounts of hidden cannons and legendary sword work, but Clara always emphasized that true heroism lay not in violence itself, but in the willingness to protect those who could not protect themselves. Mrs. Helena Kowalski returned 6 months later with her healthy infant son, a boy she had named Ezra in honor of the ferry captain whose protection had ensured safe passage during the most vulnerable period of her life. The child slept peacefully in his mother's arms as Captain Thorne guided them across waters that had once run red with the blood of pirates and their victims, but now carried families toward futures built on the foundation of security that good men had purchased through sacrifice and skill. Pastor Mills made the ferry crossing part of his regular circuit, though age and injury from the pirate attack had forced him to reduce his travel schedule significantly. He often spent the crossing time in conversation with Captain Thorne about forgiveness, redemption, and the possibility of finding peace after violence had marked a man's life with scars both visible and hidden. Their discussions never reached firm conclusions, but both men found comfort in questions that acknowledged the complexity of living honorably in an often dishonorable world. Samuel Hutchins became something approaching a living historian of river legend, carrying stories of the River Ghost's final battle to trading posts and settlements throughout the frontier territory. His accounts always emphasized the precision with which justice had been delivered, the protection afforded to innocent passengers, and the difference between necessary force and gratuitous violence. Word spread that travel on Captain Thorne's ferry meant safety beyond what any escort service could provide. 6 months after Maddox's execution, a monument appeared at the Willowbrook Landing ferry crossing, erected by subscription from trading companies, frontier families, and territorial officials who understood the significance of what had transpired on these waters. The simple granite marker bore an inscription that read, "Here the River Ghost made his final stand, protecting innocent travelers and proving that some legends live to serve others rather than themselves." Pirates and river raiders began giving Captain Thorne's ferry a wide berth that extended for miles in every direction, understanding that the aging ferry captain's reputation provided protection more effective than cavalry patrols or federal marshals. His mere presence on these waters served as a deterrent to criminal activity, allowing honest travelers to cross in safety while avoiding the violence that had once made river travel a desperate gamble for survival. Captain Thorne's daily routine returned to the peaceful rhythm he had maintained for 15 years before Maddox's crew had forced him to become the River Ghost one final time. He rose before dawn to check his vessel's condition, greeted passengers with quiet courtesy, and guided them safely across waters that held memories of both triumph and tragedy in their brown depths. Yet something had changed in the quality of respect he received from those who traveled under his care. Passengers no longer saw him as simply an aging ferry operator, but as living frontier legend who had chosen humility over fame and peaceful service over the power that his reputation could have commanded. Children pointed with wonder at the man whose story they had heard from their parents, while adults traveled with the confidence that came from knowing their safety rested in hands that had proven capable of protecting innocent lives against overwhelming odds. The locked chest remained in its position near the ferry's stern, but it stayed closed now except for the occasional cleaning and maintenance that any responsible person gave to treasured possessions. The naval coat, the engraved spyglass, and the twin pistols rested in their custom compartments, available if needed but no longer required for the daily task of carrying peaceful travelers across a river that had finally learned to run clear instead of red. Evening often found Captain Thorne at the small cemetery outside Willowbrook Landing, kneeling beside two simple headstones that marked the graves of Margaret and Sarah Thorne. He would speak quietly to his wife and daughter about passengers he had carried safely across the water, about children who now played where once only violence had flourished, and about the peace that had finally come to waters that had claimed too many innocent lives. His reflection on legacy centered not on the battles he had won or the enemies he had defeated, but on the families who could now travel safely because good men had been willing to stand against evil when the moment demanded courage over comfort. The River Ghost's final battle had not been about revenge or personal satisfaction, but about ensuring that future generations could cross these waters without fear of predators who mistook helplessness for opportunity. 1 year after the confrontation that had ended Captain Maddox's reign of terror, Captain Thorne stood at his ferry's helm watching the sunset paint the Missouri River in shades of gold and crimson that reminded him of better times, peaceful times, when the greatest danger facing river travelers was weather rather than human cruelty. Passengers on the evening crossing included young families, elderly couples, and frontier entrepreneurs whose dreams depended on safe passage to new opportunities. The transformation was complete. Waters that had once belonged to whoever possessed the most guns and the least conscience had been reclaimed for honest travelers who paid fair prices for reliable service and received protection that extended far beyond the simple ferry crossing itself. The River Ghost's legend lived on not through continued violence, but through the peace that his final stand had purchased for innocent people who deserved to travel without fear. As stars began appearing in the darkening sky above the Missouri River, Captain Ezra Thorne guided his ferry safely to Willowbrook Landing, helped his passengers disembark with the same careful courtesy he had shown for 15 years, and prepared his vessel for another night of rest before tomorrow's crossing would bring new faces and new opportunities to serve those who trusted their safety to his hands. Some legends retire gracefully, fading into memory and campfire stories told by old men who claim to remember better days. But true heroes understand that their greatest victory lies not in the enemies they defeat, but in the innocent lives they protect, the communities they heal, and the peace they leave behind for future generations who will cross safe waters because good men chose to stand when standing mattered most. If you enjoyed this tale of courage on America's great rivers, where legends prove that age and wisdom can triumph over youth and cruelty, please like this video and subscribe to our channel for more stories of frontier justice and heroic stands. We bring you tales every week of ordinary people who found extraordinary courage when innocent lives hung in the balance. Until next time, may you find the strength to stand when others cannot, and may your crossings be safe and peaceful.